Introduction to Philosophy and Theory class. My name is Julian. We are coming to you live from New York City. And to my
Hence
left.
the dimensions of the space. Hello, welcome. Good morning. Happy
Today, Today we're going to be talking about Zizek's particular brand of Marxism. We're going to be talking about Freudian Lacanian death drive, aka Todestrieb. And along the way, we're going to introduce you to the many different psychoanalytic and metaphysical ways in which Zizek conceptualizes the trajectory from Hegel to Marx. If you're joining us for the very first time today, we're so glad you're here. We are an open, global learning community. Every class is open access. Every class can be watched online for free, both on YouTube, hello YouTube, and on Instagram, hello Instagram. However, we wouldn't be able to do this without the very generous support of our patrons. So a big shout out and a big thank you to our global community of patrons, because you guys keep this crazy dream of teaching open access theory and philosophy alive. We're so grateful to you.
Yes, and you have, Julian hasn't mentioned, but you have one more month to buy the current ebook on Patreon.
That's right.
Let us know where you're joining us from. We always like to see where our students are tuning in from around the world. As Julian mentioned, we're in New York City, and I'm very much enjoying a bit of sunshine. So
I know, it's like we've
starting your week with us. Yeah.
We finally have proper lighting, like for the first time ever. I hope that the sound is okay. Are we in a prison? Close. We are in a cheap hotel room in downtown New York City, so it is similar to a prison. It does look a little bit like you and I are sharing like a prison cell.
We've finally been institutionalized.
Those of you who have watched these classes, of course, know Lacan's riff on Heidegger. When Heidegger said that language is like a house that we live in, Lacan simply said that language is in fact a prison that we live in. We are currently stuck in the prison of philosophy and theory with you. School can be another prison. That's true. Actually, okay, this is like a little thing on the side, but I went to school in many different countries, but one of the countries I went to school in was Holland. And our school building was actually situated in a renovated prison. And so it had literally, like, the classrooms were like former cells, and then there was like a prison ward in the middle that was our recess area. And the janitor would like do the rounds. And there was something very Dutch about it, because it was sort of like this post-ironic take on civic education, that we were going to take a place which was formerly of incarceration and we would turn it into emancipation, as it were. All right, I think we should just jump right in, but yes. Thank you for plugging the book briefly. Yep. My ebook, The Vanishing Mediator. I was going to say The Hermeneutic Temptation, but that's the previous ebook, the one that's gone.
The one that's already vanished.
The Vanishing Mediator is still available for 1 month exclusively for patrons on Patreon. And for those of you who have already read the book, thank you for your comments. And yeah, I just feel very, very grateful that I get to release writing. And thank you, Jeneline, for editing the book, which is the real labor here. Okay, I think we should just jump right in, but do let us know where you're joining us from. Just leave us a comment that really, really does make us very happy. And I think it's also nice for other people to see that we're sort of all connecting somehow. This is my liberal, multicultural aspect of us reaching out. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Zizek's Marxism. And in the past, I've referred to Zizek as a strange Marxist, an accusation that Jordan Peterson made in the so-called debate between Peterson and Žižek. And Žižek says, yes, indeed, I am a strange Marxist. So what makes Žižek a strange Marxist? Well, in a previous class, we talked about the fact that Žižek has a psychoanalytic take on Marxism. In other words, that he takes the psychoanalytic concept of the symptom and relates that to the hermeneutic operation within Marxism, a hermeneutic that many people call the hermeneutics of suspicion. So what is the hermeneutics of suspicion? That's something we're going to answer today. Stick around. We've got about 60 minutes to dive more deeply into these concepts, and hopefully to do it in a way that is accessible to you guys, even if you're a beginner, and yet remains satisfying if you are a so-called expert. An intermediate. You can basically play this game of philosophy on cheat mode, or you can play it on, I don't know, extra hard mode. You can have multiple lives or no lives. Okay, so Žižek has often said that if you want to understand Zizek's particular brand of Marxism, you have to understand the concept of Todestrieb, or death drive. And one of Zizek's main arguments is that death drive, far from being just a psychoanalytic concept, which relates to the principle called the pleasure principle, which we'll explain in due course, that the death drive is in fact a philosophical concept. In other words, that you can take the idea of death drive and apply it to a Hegelian metaphysics. And if you apply it to a Hegelian metaphysics, then you end up with a different way of reading Marx. Because, as most people will tell you, one of the most interesting ways to read Marx's work is precisely through the lens of how Marx relates to Hegel. In other words, how we go from speculative idealism towards dialectical materialism. Dialectical materialism, I want to make a very quick note, is not necessarily Marx's own idea. It's Engels' philosophical take on Marx's historical materialism. Now, if that's a whole bunch of jargon that I'm throwing at you, don't worry. We're going to take a little bit of time to unpack that. So what is the death drive? What is Todestrieb? Well, first of all, you have to understand that for Lacan and for Freud, there's slightly different ways of explaining death drive. So let's start by saying what death drive is not. Death drive is not wanting death. Death drive is not a suicidal tendency. Death drive is not that conservative talking point by which a society, unless it is controlled by forces, will succumb to anarchy. It is not anarchy versus order. The death drive is not the process by which we, in a sense, decivilize ourselves if we're left to our own immediate impulses. Death drive is not the egoistic drive. Death drive is not the process by which we all turn against each other. And the reason I say this in a dramatic way is that death drive is often falsely portrayed as being a kind of negative drive, by which we undermine ourselves. If you look at the Will Smith incident last week, the slap that launched 1,000 tweets, Will Smith had a conservative take on death drive when he said that Denzel Washington had told him that the devil comes for you at your highest moment. That's a conservative take on death drive. The idea that at our peak, at our most glorious moment, at our moment of triumph, we find ways to undermine and harm ourselves. Death drive, I want to say this again, death drive is not self-sabotage. Instead, death drive has to do with the particular paradox of being alive. Now, what is the particular paradox of being alive? The paradox of being alive is that we feel like we're never enough. We feel like we're always chasing the next thing. Now, phones can give you the proxy of that chase by giving you serotonin constantly. And so you become hooked to a simulacrum of life that is now existing on your phone. But your phone is simply continuing a fundamental paradox of existence, which is that we only experience being alive by means of external triggers. This is, of course, the whole point of meditation, to try to resensitize yourself towards an inner kind of being that isn't reliant on external simulation. I say simulation, that's a Freudian slip. I mean stimulation. Simulation and stimulation. And so what is death drive? If you want to understand death drive, you can put it very simply. Death drive is the paradox by which you experience your own life through negation. Whether it's the negation of time that is available to you in your lifespan, whether it's the negation of attention that you dedicate to one thing versus something else. For example, you can't be reading a book and watching a movie at the same time as much as you would like to. This is also why I've often said that the proof of the existence of God must surely be that we can drink coffee, listen to music, and read a book at the same time whilst texting our best friends. The idea of death drive is that in order to be, you have to negate. In other words, in order to be, you have to be an agent of your own becoming. And in order to be an agent of your own becoming, you have to be in relation to others. We are not islands unto ourselves. This is also crucially why Lacan situates the death drive, the Todestrieb, in the symbolic order. The imaginary order is precisely the disavowal of death drive. In the imaginary order, we're complete beings. In the imaginary order, we exist in a kind of flow, a flux. And yet the truth is that we exist in the symbolic order. We exist in relations to others. As much as we try to guard ourselves from the other structures and conditions the way in which we experience ourselves, for better or for worse. And so for Lacan, the Todestrieb, the death drive, is situated in the symbolic order. The symbolic order gives us a reason to live, and yet a reason to question why we live. And so we're constantly stuck in this paradox, what I call the paradox of being alive, the paradox by which every single day there's a growing sensation, a suspicion, that you are simply moving from one thing to the next. Whether it's structuring your day according to breakfast, lunch, and dinner, whether it's picking up your child after school and putting them to bed, reading them in, tucking them in bed, and then doing the whole thing over again. It's like the 9 Inch Nails song, which is everything, now I'm just blanking on it. It's, wow, I just totally blanked on that. There's a 9 Inch Nails song that's basically about this. Someone here will know what the song is, about how everything repeats. And so what's really important here is that if you want to understand death drive is related to repetition. It's the way in which we understand and make sense of our life is by means of repeating actions. Now, of course, we can find comfort in repetition. You could call this habit. But repetition can also be discomforting. Repetition can be alienating. Repetition can be something that once you scratch at it, you start wondering, why am I even doing this in the first place? And if you think about it, your life is a sequence of repetition. From the day you're born, you're taught to follow certain patterns of being and behaving and thinking. And that's how you structure and make sense of your life and how you fit into it. I remember when I was young, I suddenly had the experience, which I think was the profound emancipatory experience, when I realized that I could go and see a movie by myself. If I had pocket money, I could go and see a movie. I didn't have to go with somebody else. That is already something where you break a habit, a predetermined idea of what you can and cannot do. Now, of course, money can be an agent of breaking those habits. Money can give you the idea that you can do more things than you actually can. And yet, even then, you're simply chasing new and different ways in which to spend that money. And so what happens is that as we go through life, whether it's the repetition of school, whether it's the repetition of going to bed at a certain time and waking up, whether it's the repetition of cultivating certain habits or certain routines, life is experienced as a variety of repetitions. In other words, as a process of repeating your own self. And as you continue to repeat yourself, a certain sensation begins to dawn on you, which is that your experience of life and your temporal existence within the stream of your own becoming has less to do with an immediate unity or completeness of your own being, and more to do with a fundamental process of wanting the next thing. And this is how we end up with the death drive. Remember, death drive is not just the movement towards death. Death drive is the uncanny realization that in order to live, you have to be in the paradoxical situation of suffering what Lacan calls the symbolic death. And here we can be quite literal. There are many ways in which we feel most alive precisely at the moment that we are dead to our own selves. This is Todestrieb in a nutshell. It's what the French call the petit mort. It's an orgasm. It's the moment, the climactic moment in sex, in which we feel detached from our own bodies and our own selves, and yet somehow paradoxically more in life and more in tune with life than we ever have before. For some people, it's related to taking drugs. For other people, it's going on a long run. You experience the so-called runner's high. The runner's high is pretty much the perfect definition of the Todestrieb and the paradox of the death drive, which is that by means of repetition, by means of a sustained period of repetition, which is long distance running, you suddenly experience that you are transcendent from your own repetition. You inhabit your life precisely by not being in the flow of life as such. And so you realize that death drive, rather than being a self-destructive urge, is precisely the paradoxical condition by which we transcend our own being and the conditions of our own becoming. Think about it. When you're in nature, when you're climbing a mountain, you feel more alive than when you're watching a mountain on TV. When you're embracing struggle, you usually feel more alive than when you're enjoying the fruits of your own success. And the same is true for desire. As long as you desire, you feel alive. The most terrifying thing would be to stop desiring. And that's also why Lacan fundamentally links death drive with the pleasure principle. In other words, we don't desire a thing as such. We desire to keep on desiring. And of course, this is where capitalism is oh so clever. Capitalism allows you to not climb the mountain, to not have the struggle, to not do the things that make you feel most alive. Capitalism allows you a simulacrum of life. Experience nature while on the couch. Experience sex whilst watching pornography on the couch. Experience the joys and peaks and lows of life through reality TV. And Žižek simply takes that idea and continues it for everything. Žižek argues that one of the fundamental principles of ideology is that it sells you the opposite of the essence of the thing. For example, you could now have a pastry without sugar. You could have coffee without caffeine. You could have sex without the risk of being hurt afterwards. We engage in life without having the complete experience of life. We engage in life with a kind of parachute by which we inhibit our own selves from having the full experience. And death drive is, of course, precisely the paradox by which we feel most alive at the exact point that we're doing something that seems to be negating life itself. And so death drive provides you with a kind of repetition, and yet at the same time a kind of release, a kind of escape from that repetition. This is also why we feel so dead inside, symbolically dead, as Lacan would put it, when we're stuck in repetition that is not of our own making. When we're in repetition through our job, when we're in repetition through ill health, when we're in repetition through the community that has a stranglehold on us, whether it's religious or political. When we experience repetition that is not of our own making, we feel dead inside. When we feel like we are repeating ourselves on our own behalf, through struggle, through achievement, through art, through exercise, we feel like we have found a release from the tedium of simply being. Now, of course, this is a simplification. In many ways, you could say that repetition of your own choosing links up to repetition that isn't of your own choosing. This is something I talked about when it came to Sartre and Sartre's existentialism. Sartre says that freedom isn't doing what you want, freedom is wanting what you do. And there's a really big difference here. When you say I am doing what I want, you are again in the imaginary, what Lacan calls the imaginary, the idea that there is a you that could autonomously, freely determine what it is that you want to do. That is the ultimate imaginary relationship to yourself. The idea that you're desiring isn't related to an overarching, let's call it, manufacturing of said desire, that you could be free from ideology. And yet, as Sartre puts it, it's not about doing what you want, it's about wanting what you do. In other words, to say, yes, I may be restricted and I may be constrained, and yes, life may be an elaborate trap designed to make me go through a maze that leads only to my own death. And yet it's precisely within that maze that I can exert the minimal element of autonomous will that will get me through that process. This is ultimately also how you should understand Camus' idea about the happiness of Sisyphus. Sisyphus isn't happy because he's doing what he wants. Sisyphus realizes at a certain point that he wants what he does. In other words, he embraces his own fate. That's something I talked about in the last class, that for Kierkegaard and for Nietzsche, freedom isn't the opposite of fate. Freedom is embracing your own fate. This is the happiness of Sisyphus in a nutshell. It's the idea that you realize at a certain point that you are stuck within the repetition of that which we call life. You are stuck within the repetition of the Todestrieb. And the best you can do is to find it within you to embrace your fate. To say, I am the autonomous agent of my own becoming. I am not the creator of my fate. And this is totally against the self-help principle that you are the creator of your own fate. It's the exact opposite. It's because you experience fate that you are fundamentally free. This is what I talked about last week with Lacan's take on Dostoevsky. When Dostoevsky says that in a world with God, nothing is allowed, in other words, if there is a God, everything is prohibited, Lacan says, no, it's exactly the opposite. It's because there is a God that nothing is prohibited. It's precisely because there is fate that free will can be enacted. In other words, fate is not the opposite of will. Fate is the precondition for the embrace of will. It's only in a world of fate that will can make itself be manifest. That is why Sisyphus is happy. Now, to bring this back to Todestrieb, to the idea of death drive. If death drive is a philosophical principle, as Zizek holds, then why does it make death drive a Marxist principle? That's what we're going to explain now. Okay, so Žižek is a strange Marxist. And by strange, I mean that he is a psychoanalytic Marxist. What Zizek does over and over again is to take concepts and principles from Lacanian psychoanalysis and apply them to the Marxist hermeneutic, the Marxist method, the method of inquiry. Hermeneutics is simply an expensive word for the way in which we interpret reality. And so if you look at reality through a Marxist lens, Zizek simply does what the optometrist does, which is he inserts a new lens and he says, what if you look through the world not just through a Marxist lens, but zip, now it's a psychoanalytic plus Marxist lens. In this case, Zizek takes the idea of symptom and pleasure principle and applies it to Marxism. In Zizek's book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, he essentially starts by saying there's an equivalent, there's an analogous method between Freud's investigation into dreams, his analysis of dreams, and Marx's analysis of the commodity form. Now, there is already a sneaky way of getting into psychoanalysis and Marxism here, which is that if you've read Marx, you know that he's not just looking at the commodity form, he's looking at the commodity fetish, fetish being what is essentially a psychoanalytic idea. And Žižek says that the Freudian dream analysis goes in two steps that are exactly mirrored within the Marxist analysis of the commodity. Now, what are those two steps? Step number one, we look at something that appears to be ordinary, and yet we find it to be extraordinary. This is true both for the dream. Dreams are, of course, universal. Everybody experiences them. In fact, they're so ordinary that if you really want to bore somebody, you tell them about your dreams. A sign of intimacy is that you can tell somebody about your dream and that they will feign interest, because the last thing we want to hear from other people are their subjective dreams. And so Freud takes something that seems to be ordinary, something that's seemingly out of the, not of interest to us, which is the dream, and says, let's take this seriously. That's step one. Now, Marx does the same thing for the commodity. Marx says, let's look at the most ordinary commodities. Let's look at a shoe. Let's look at a table. And let's find how this seemingly ordinary shoe, everyone has a shoe in the same way that everyone has dreams, has in and of itself extraordinary features. In fact, Marx refers to it literally as being magical powers. Now, those of you who are more familiar with the critique of capitalism will immediately suspect that there is already something at work within capitalism. When a Nike shoe is presented to you as being the vehicle of your own athletic expression, in other words, you will jump higher with the shoe, nobody actually thinks that they will jump higher with the shoe. Instead, there's the association of the shoe with a successful athlete that, again, doesn't convince you that you will actually be Michael Jordan, but you will be sharing and partaking in the same experience that Michael Jordan shares and partakes of. In other words, we infuse the commodity with magical properties, not because we believe in those properties, but because we know that even though it's not true, it makes us feel stronger and better and fitter, etc. This is also Žižek's relationship to the idea of ideology within existentialism. Existentialism has the idea of mauvaise foi, false consciousness. Now, Žižek says that false consciousness isn't acting without knowledge. It's not saying, I bought this Nike shoe because I think I will jump higher, and now I'm disappointed. It's saying, I'm buying this shoe knowing perfectly well that it will not make an iota of difference to my athletic performance. In fact, I probably won't even play basketball. I'll wear them to the office, but it's going to make me feel special. There's something that I find very interesting within the way in which women write and talk about wearing sexy underwear. It's the same thing, where you wear I'm assuming, some women say, I wear a thong, which as far as I know is very uncomfortable. I wear a thong not to be sexy to other men, but to be sexy to myself. This is what Marx calls the commodity fetish. It's that there is something that is taken away from what you would think it signifies, and yet it provides you a kind of real satisfaction. I walk in the world as if I could jump higher because I'm wearing the shoes of someone who jumps higher. I walk in the world as if I were sexier because I am wearing the clothes of someone who would be sexy. That is how we take something seemingly ordinary and imbue it with magical properties. Now, we're still at step one because it gets more interesting, hopefully. Now, if step one is that we take something ordinary, seemingly ordinary, like a dream or a shoe and we imbue it with importance, we take it seriously, then the second step is, how do we take it seriously? This is how you can understand the analogy that Žižek makes between Marx and Freud. In fact, why he says that it was Marx who invented the symptom, not Freud. If you analyze your dream from a Marxist perspective, I'm being dumb, Freudian slip. If you analyze the dream from a Freudian perspective, which is not a Jungian perspective, it's to say, I'm not interested in the content of the dream. I'm not interested in what the dream symbolizes. This is, if you ever want to understand the difference between Freud and Jung in a nutshell, Jung believes in the idea of symbols, that something symbolizes something, that we have certain archetypes. Freud isn't interested in the content of the symbol. Instead, Freud wants to understand, why did that symbol appear to you in the first place? And so if we take the classic Marxist framework, namely the difference between form and content, when Freud looks at the dream and he analyzes your dream and he wants you to explain what you have dreamt of, he's not interested in the content of your dream. In other words, did you dream of unicorns or falling off a cliff? Instead, Freud is interested in why the dream took on that particular form. Imagine that you're going to the movies and you're coming out of the movie and someone asks you, did you like the movie? There's two ways you can answer that question. You can say, yes, I liked it because it had beautiful actors in it and I liked the setting and I also liked the set pieces. In other words, I liked the content of the movie. Or you could say, I liked the narrative structure. I like the cinematography, I like the editing, I like the sound design. As soon as you engage with the technical components, the components that of course the Oscars don't find interesting enough to actually do in the Oscars, that's when you're making a structural analysis. In other words, you're looking not at the content, which is the overt display of what is in the movie, but you're looking at the form, the way in which the content is presented. And here comes Freud's fundamental insight, which is strictly speaking analogous to the Marxist insight, which is that it is neither about the investigation into the content, nor is it into the investigation of the form. Instead, what you have to investigate is the content of the form itself. In other words, the way in which the form betrays an unacknowledged, quote-unquote, hidden content. And now, my dear friends, you can understand why Marx's hermeneutic is referred to as the hermeneutics of suspicion. If the hermeneutics of suspicion is simply to say, in a world that appears to be divided between form and content, I'm actually interested in the content hidden in the form itself, in other words, repressed in the form to take on psychoanalytic content, what is the quote-unquote symptomatic emergence of that repression? In other words, if there is content that is hidden in the form itself, how does that content come out? And here is the answer to why Freud and Marx relate. How does the hidden content in the form come out? For Freud, it comes out in the dream. In other words, if your own subjectivity, if your own being is precisely the illusion that you are content, when you are in fact nothing but form, the subject of the unconscious, as Lacan and Freud call it, then how is it that content, my being, emerges through the structural form of my becoming? Ergo, I know this is a little bit technical, but ergo, it means that who you think you are is symptomatic. It's symptomatic by confusing your own being with content when it is in fact the symptomatic emergence of a kind of being that emerges through the repression of the content in the form. In other words, that you, as a person, as a subject, are simply the walking symptom of your own illusion, namely that you are content and not form, which hides content. I know that's intense, but if you see it that way, you can understand that the Freudian Lacanian idea of subjectivity, of being you, is simply the process by which you misconceive your own subjective being as having content, when that content is the result of the repression of that reality which is that you are pure structure. You are the subject of the unconscious. You are conditioned by desires. You are conditioned by the symbolic order. You stitch that up through the imaginary illusion that you are in fact a complete autonomous being of content. And it is precisely in the disavowed content of the form, namely the subject of the unconscious, that you emerges. Now, why does that link to Marxism? Here's why. What is the critique of ideology, not just for Žižek, but for Nietzsche? It is simply the process by which we unearth the content hidden in the form. In other words, when we go back to the idea of the shoe and the commodity, it's not saying what is the shoe actually worth? What does the shoe actually do? Instead, it is how is, through structures, i.e. my relationship to others, for example, Michael Jordan, my relationship to what Adorno would call the culture industry that presents Michael Jordan as being a godlike figure, that I could attain some kind of association with that godlike substance by means of a Nike shoe. That is the structure. In other words, it's not the content of the shoe. It's not the leather. It's not the bounciness. It's not whether or not I could jump the way Michael Jordan jumps. It's not even about a racial difference. It's about the structure of desire that creates the commodity. In other words, the critique of ideology for Marx is nothing more and nothing less than investigating the hidden content in the form itself. And the first thing you have to do if you want to look at the hidden content in the form is to eliminate your fascination with the content. And now you can understand what bourgeois ideology is. Bourgeois ideology is to hone in on the content. Oh, this is good craftsmanship. This is well made. This will last you a lifetime. This is a shoe that is better than any other shoe. This is a performance item, etc., etc. As soon as you focus on purely the content of the shoe, you are in the realm of bourgeois ideology, specifically because you're no longer looking at the underlying content hidden within the form itself, which creates the shoe not as shoe, but the shoe as commodity. If you go back to Nietzsche, the idea is that ideology is simply das Gleichsetzen des Nicht-Gleichen, which means to take those two things that are not equitable and to make them equitable. On the one hand, it's about the value of the shoe, right? Why is one Nike shoe suddenly worth $1,000 when another shoe can be worth $50? It's also the means by which I make myself supposedly equitable with Michael Jordan. Why am I suddenly buying shoes that are made for pro athletes? Why are you buying winter coats at the North Face that are designed to take you up mountains into Arctic temperatures? That is das Gleichsetzen des Nicht-Gleichen, right? I am not somebody who's going to go climb Mount Everest, so why do I wear clothes as if I were going to climb Mount Everest, right? And so there's many ways within ideology that we do this abstraction, the abstraction of goods, the abstraction of value, the abstraction by which we do things that we buy things for things that we're not actually going to do. That is the process of ideology. And so if you look into the structure, you find the hidden content within the form. Namely, that capitalism requires this constant abstraction between what something is and what something could be. In other words, the way in which you experience yourself as a commodity, between what you are and what you might be. That is the fundamental principle of most media, most advertisement today, is to sell you not a product, but to sell you a dream. Specifically to sell you a dream not of the product, but a dream of you. In other words, a dream of a better you. A dream that you are the agent of your own becoming as long as you buy into the proper commodities. And again, to go back to bourgeois ideology is nothing more and nothing less than teaching you what to desire and teaching you what to purchase. There's entire magazines that are dedicated, consumer reports, that will give you an in-depth analysis of 50 different types of washing machines so that when you decide to buy the washing machine, you will buy the correct one. Now, of course, as Lacan will tell you, this is already an indication of the pleasure principle. Why? The pleasure principle isn't that you actually want to buy a washing machine, because come on, who gets that excited about a washing machine? Although, if you buy a nice Milo washing machine, it's a whole... Anyway, I have my own bourgeois affectations. I'm a well-trained bourgeois. The pleasure principle states that you don't want the washing machine. You want to compare all the washing machines. I used to go into a camera store and I would say, I'm not here to buy a camera. I want to fondle all the cameras. I want to take pleasure in comparing all of the different cameras. And this is, of course, the fundamental bourgeois consumptive ideal. It's to say, I will spend a year investigating every DVD player, every Blu-ray player, every computer, and I will know more about these devices than the clerk knows in the Best Buy or in the store. And then finally, I will make the most educated consumer decision so that I now have bought something that is better quality, better make, it's more ethical, it will last me for at least 10 or 20 years, and I am a conscious consumer. My friends, this is bourgeois ideology. To be a conscious consumer, to base your identity and your ethics and your morality not on what you do, but what you buy. Which means that what you've chosen to desire is not who you are and what you are becoming, but who you think you are by virtue of the consumer decisions you are making. And of course, this is precisely the ideology of lifestyle. Lifestyle sells you the idea that if you want to escape the paradox of being, the paradox by which your life is a mere sequence of repetition that you do in which you hope to find some kernel of meaning and perhaps a grain of satisfaction before you reach your imminent demise, that you can fill in that repetition of breathing, of blinking, of thinking, of pulsing heart. You can fill that in with a kind of endless sequence of consumer choices, of lifestyle. And this is the immortality that we seek within fashion. It's the immortality that we seek within consumptive practices. It's the immortality that we seek within desire as such. And it's all a way of distracting us from the fact that if you take away all those things, which aren't bad things, right? I'm not moralizing. If you take all those bad way things, all we are is a flesh bag that repeats. We swallow, we breathe, we blink, we consume food, we shit, we piss, we have a heartbeat. We are vehicles of repetition. And the way that we try to give that meaning is, of course, by procreating, which is further repetition. We create a copy of ourselves with another person. And in order to have a partner for life and create another person, we find someone who we think is a copy of ourselves, in other words, our lover. And so we repeat, we're constantly leaving the same mark on the world. And you can do two things. You can despair. You can become a passive nihilist. You can look at the world as being meaningless and empty and a kind of horrific abyss by which all you have to look forward to is a variation on a theme. Or you could say that it's precisely within the minutiae of that repetition, within the tedium that is almost a kind of delirium of your own being by which you repeat the little things every day. You can find within that the meaning of life itself. You can become what Nietzsche called an active nihilist. You can find the happiness of Sisyphus. It's saying, my fate may be to be a machine of reproduction, and yet I will allow myself to be the best possible machine of reproduction. It's to say, you and I yesterday Jenny and I saw a movie called Everything Everywhere All at Once. And the key emotional moment, and it's not even really a spoiler, is one of the characters says, in all of the infinite universes in which I could be other people, in which I could have had other achievements, in which I could be happier and wealthier and more successful and more accomplished, I choose this universe. I want to be with you, even if it means that we're boring and we're poor and we're not successful and we're desperate and we're struggling. I choose to be with you. In other words, that it's precisely within the embrace of love, the embrace of connection, the embrace of attachment, that we find something that seems to transcend the mere meaningless repetition. And the fundamental lie of capitalism is that it sells you the idea that you don't need love to get out of that paradox of repetition. That you simply need to keep on repeating better and more. That if you climb up the proverbial ladder and you buy more expensive clothes and more expensive cars and more expensive food, as long as you situate yourself within the rat race of status and becoming, that you will find an escape from the tedium of repetition of life. When nothing could be less true, the more you start living that way, the more you become trapped within a maze of your own creation. You start setting yourself goals that are not goals, they're simply goal posts. And that's exactly when you realize that all of that is empty. And that it's precisely within the thing you were running away from, the emptiness, the repetition, the seemingly mundane fabric of being. It's precisely within that meaning emerges retroactively. In other words, we're back at a kind of Žižekian teleology. It's that meaning emerges after the fall. The meaning of life, the truth, the purpose of your own being emerges precisely at a perceived loss of that being. That when you can fundamentally look into the kind of abyss of life as a process of Todestrieb, of repetition of becoming, that you are freed from it, that you are the happy kind of Sisyphus. And as long as you are Sisyphus who believes that if only he works up enough credit for his credit card, he can get rid of the boulder, that's when you're stuck. That's when you're stuck within ideology. That's when you're stuck within desire. Now, I want to end this class by talking about why Žižek takes this idea of Todestrieb, which would just take 40 minutes to sort of explain, and how he relates that to Marx. Now, we've already put together the idea of Freud and Marx, that they have a 1-2 step principle. Step 1, take something that seems ordinary and take it seriously. For Freud, it's the dream. For Marx, it's the commodity. Secondly, to investigate not the formal content of that thing, so not the content of the dream, nor the content of the commodity, but to look at the underlying content of the form itself. In other words, in the seeming binary between content and form, between what something is and how something is, to look at the content that is repressed within the form itself. In other words, step 3 is where Marx and Freud fuse. Namely, that the commodity is what structures being. In other words, it's not that the commodity is what debases us. It's that the commodity is what ironically infuses us with an idea of itself. I'm not explaining this very well, but if the self is fundamentally incomplete, then the ultimate illusion is the idea of completeness. The ultimate illusion is the idea that you could be whole, that you could be someone who is not feeling a gnawing sense of incompleteness. The ultimate idea, the ultimate fantasy is the idea that you could be complete, that you will be satisfied, that you will find a moment in which everything makes sense. The truth is that you may have instances, moments, fleeting periods of time in which things make sense, in which you feel like you inhabit your life. And yet, ironically, that happens precisely at the moments in which you are seemingly detached from the stakes of your own existence, whether it's through sex, whether it's through love, whether it's through, for some people, religion. It's precisely the dialectic of presence and absence that you experience yourself most fully at the moment that you become relatively detached from the stakes of your own becoming. You were going to say?
It's also, I think, important to guard against what we might call this kind of nihilistic capitalism, which I feel like we see sometimes in like cryptocurrency ads, which is like the world is just becoming a hellscape, so you might as well just, eat hamburgers and, screw everybody else, basically. That's not... That's sort of the perversion of this insight, I'd say.
Yeah, I think that there's this nihilistic doom-laden sense increasingly, which is that if the world is going to hell, we might as well pretend like it's not going to hell, and it becomes like this self-reinforcing spiral. But what's really important about Todestrieb is repetition. Wiederholungszwang is what Freud calls it. If you want to understand what Wiederholungszwang is, simply look at somebody who's doom scrolling on their phone. Doom scrolling is the process by which, simply by looking at all the bad things that are happening on your phone, you somehow for a moment feel, like you've distracted yourself from one form of anxiety and you've overloaded on other people's anxieties, essentially. And a lot of us are caught in the middle. We're caught between this kind of Wiederholungszwang and the idea that what capitalism sells us is the Wiederholungszwang, the repetition of our own, agency as a consumer, as a CEO, as an entrepreneur, etc. And so the real question is, can we find a form of subjectivity that isn't beholden to this ideological fantasy, the fantasy of completeness? And that's also the paradox of Marxist utopia. Utopia is the idea of a place within yourself in which nothing is lacking. In other words, a place in which you have found momentary completeness, both within yourself and within the symbolic order. Now, I want to end with a bit more Žižek here, because I know you guys have stuck with us for a long time. I appreciate that, both in YouTube and Instagram. So we started this by saying, why is Žižek a strange Marxist? And why does Žižek take the idea of Todestrieb, of death drive, and apply it to Marxism? It's because Žižek argues that the death drive functions within metaphysics. Now, how does that work? The traditional metaphysical divide is, you might say, a division between essence and appearance, between the ideal Platonic form and the debased material reality of subjective being. Objects in the world and objects an sich, as Kant put it, the essence of objects. Now, for Kantian transcendental idealism, the objective is how we can find essence within objects. In other words, how can we transcend the appearance of objects and find their essence? That is the purpose of transcendental idealism, to transcend the object towards the ideal. It's an upward motion, as it were. Hegel has what you call speculative idealism. Hegel says that in the binary between essence and appearance, essence emerges only in appearance. And so suddenly we've canceled out the transcendental sphere. Hence also why it is no longer transcendental idealism. Suddenly, essence appears within that from which it is seen to fall. In other words, essence and appearance are one and the same. They're dialectically mediated. Now, if you want to know why Hegel is a Christian thinker and why this is something that is accomplished by means of a Christian quote-unquote logic, it's because Hegel makes the same argument apropos God and Christ in the New Testament. If in the Old Testament we have the God of the transcendental realm, the ideal God, and we have human beings here on earth who are saying, oh my God, if only we can figure out what you want from us, then we will appease you, right? This is, Jeanline and I went to the opera Elektra, and Elektra has what might be one of the first critiques of bourgeois ideology. Elektra, who cannot sleep because she is haunted by the guilt of having killed Agamemnon. Clytemnestra, sorry. Thank you. Elektra is the character, the daughter. Clytemnestra, who cannot sleep because she's haunted by the guilt of having killed Agamemnon, goes to Elektra and says, tell me the correct ritual to appease the gods so I can sleep. In other words, she wants a sleeping aid. Clytemnestra wants to be able to sleep better. And here we have one of the first critiques of bourgeois ideology, essentially, right? Bourgeois ideology is that which provides you a remedy whilst also providing you with the thing that creates the problem. You go into a drugstore in the United States and you will find fast food and soda and everything that's bad for you and painkillers and sleeping aids. So you can buy both the caffeine and the pill that will help you combat the caffeine, right? That is what Clytemnestra wants. Clytemnestra has murdered Agamemnon, but now wants to be the rightful ruler who is not burdened by guilt. And so she goes to Elektra and says, my dear daughter, can you please tell me the appropriate rituals? But here's why it's a real critique and not just like the figuration. In Elektra, in the opera, Clytemnestra enjoys the rituals. She finds a perverse pleasure within what are the things I have to do to debase myself before the gods to make the gods happy. In other words, Clytemnestra doesn't want to be with the gods. She doesn't want to just be. She wants the purging rituals. And that's the lifestyle of capitalism. It's detox. It's how do I spend money in order to purify myself from the dirt of being alive as a capitalist consumer. Elektra is the figure, not Elektra, Clytemnestra is the figure of the pleasure principle, which is that what she wants is the purging. What she wants is what Lacan calls the surplus enjoyment. The surplus enjoyment that comes through the rituals of cleansing that she does for the gods. And so the only time we see Clytemnestra happy is when she is asking Elektra, can you tell me all these delicious rituals I can do to cleanse myself? And importantly, where it becomes the ultimate critique of ideology, these rituals that she imagines to please the gods are not rituals that cost her anything. She says, who do I need to sacrifice to appease the gods? I will sacrifice anyone. In fact, I enjoy sacrificing people. Let me know who I have to sacrifice, and I will have them slaughtered to appease the gods so that I can have a good night's sleep. And so the objective isn't a good night's sleep. The objective is the perverse satisfaction she gets from enacting the proper rituals to appease the gods, which allow her to kill other people around her, so as to stave off the guilt of having killed Agamemnon. And that closed circle is the circle of the pleasure principle. Now, to go back to the metaphysical argument, remember, we're talking about God in the sky, transcendental idealism, and below here we have debased humanity. This is the transcendental divide. And Hegel applies the Christian logic of the New Testament to the logic of Platonic metaphysics. How does he do this? Well, simply put, it works like this. Old Testament, God is in the sky, people are down here trying to figure out what God wants. New Testament, God says, I will send you an emissary of my own being, Christ, who then fails to be Christ, who fails to prove that he is in fact the Son of God, who isn't the redeeming figure who shoots thunderbolts from his eyes. Instead, Christ is all too human, and Christ is killed on the cross. And so suddenly the all-powerful illusion of the transcendental ideal of God crumbles, it fades away, and it is made manifest precisely within the human community. In other words, when Christ says the most important thing, it's where there is love, there you will find me. In other words, where there is love, you will find essence. The transcendental ideal is no longer on another planet in another realm. It's being brought down to be made manifest here. Hegel takes this process by which the transcendental comes down to earth and simply says, what if the Platonic ideal form of essence was never there in the first place, but had to fall and emerge within appearance itself? This is the argument, the teleological argument, by which Hegel takes a Christian logical statement and turns it into a metaphysical one. And Žižek simply takes that idea of essence emerging within appearance, which is Hegel's leap from Christian logic towards metaphysics, and says, what if we take that principle and apply it to Marxism? In other words, what if we take this idea that essence emerges only in appearance and we transfuse it into the Marxist hermeneutics of suspicion? Namely, the Marxist idea being that every universal contains a quote-unquote false particular, a part of no part, as the post-Marxists would call it. For Marxists, that's the working class. The person who doesn't fit within the universal, who has seemingly fallen and is now the underclass, the untouchable, the person who doesn't exist, a life not worth caring about, a life that doesn't matter. And Žižek says, what if that essence didn't exist? What if there is no universal substance? What if there's no ideal of being within capitalism? What if the essence exists only within the particular subset that is seemingly excluded? In other words, what if the truth of capitalism is precisely capital T truth, the working class? The singular come universal, as Rancière would call it. This subjective, fallen, debased subjectivity contains the true essence of being. In other words, that the proletariat, that the excluded, that the precariat, that all of those people who seem to have fallen between the cracks, those people are the essence. Those people contain the truth of capitalism, which is that capitalism presented a false universal, a false ladder. They weren't working their way up the rung. They had to be here on holding up the ladder for other people. That this is exactly what rich people will promise you. That if you have the secrets of the rich, you too could be rich. The Marxist insight is simply to say the secret of the wealthy is that you will never be rich. The secret is that there is no secret. And that is what Hegel says about the Christian logic and the metaphysic, which is to say the secret of the New Testament is precisely that there is no secret. That God doesn't exist up there, God exists in here. That is the New Testament revolution. And when Hegel takes the Christian revolution, the logical progression from Old Testament to New Testament, and applies it to Kantian transcendental idealism, we have Christianity plus Kantian transcendental idealism, which leads to speculative idealism. Žižek simply takes that logical idea of speculative idealism and plugs it back into the computer that is the Marxist hermeneutic. And so now class struggle and revolution looks totally different. It's not we're the low, subjective, fallen people fighting against the gods of the tycoons.
And if only we could ascend the ladder
of capitalism, and one day the proletariat will be up here and you will be begging in the streets. No, it's to say that the illusion is itself that there is an above and a below. And that as soon as you realize that the above exists only in the below, the above disappears. In other words, how do you have a moment of revolutionary class consciousness by which the tycoons disappear, the billionaires disappear, is when we realize that they aren't actually above, that there is nothing there, there's nothing worth aspiring to, that essence is already here within pure subjective, poor, fallen being. And that emancipation isn't the process by which you work your way up the ladder. Emancipation is by the process by which you realize that the ladder was an illusion created so that you would never be on that ladder. That the ladder is a mirage, a false promise. That the ladder is subject to the pleasure principle by which you become Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra, who isn't trying to appease the gods or actually be a good person. Clytemnestra, who enjoys the process of keeping other people under her thumb so that she can have the perverse pleasure of the rituals so that she can appease the gods. And if Clytemnestra is like a billionaire, she's the billionaire who's saying, I am the philanthropist who is doing this for the gods, for the common good, for the other people. When what she's actually doing is she's upholding a system by which the other people only exist as willing vessels of slaughter for her own pleasure principle. Not a perfect analogy, but you get it. And so what I'm trying to say here, and what I've tried to say in an argument, is that the death drive, the Todestrieb, which is for Lacan and Freud, the Wiederholungszwang, the compulsion to repeat, is something that is both an existential principle that capitalism tries to give us an escape from by giving us a gilded version of the repetition principle, the Wiederholungszwang, which is now that of the Wiederholungszwang of success and status and consumption and perpetual desire. And at the same time, that there's also a metaphysical argument to be made by which we find the Wiederholungszwang, the Todestrieb, precisely in saying it's not about transcendental idealism, it's about speculative idealism. And how do we take the speculative subject, the subject who is the split subject for Lacan, in which essence appears through appearance itself, in which subjectivity is not the fall from grace, it is the very precondition for grace. How do you take that emancipated subject and make it the revolutionary subject? In other words, how do you make it the utopian subject? And so if utopia is that where nothing is lacking, within transcendental idealism there is a lack. There's a hole in the ideal, which is the debased subjective reality. And it's precisely when you bring those two spheres together that we exist in a utopian space, a place where nothing is lacking, a place in which the universal doesn't succumb to its own particular that contains the retroactive truth of the universal. In other words, Zizek's teleology in a nutshell is simply Hegelian Christian metaphysical logic, namely that essence appears after the fall, that the true emergence of God is precisely in the human community after the fall of Christ. Now, finally, that is analogous to the idea of revolution and to the idea of the left for Žižek, when he says that it's precisely through failure and through the failure of the revolution that the utopian principle of the emancipated subject persists. It's precisely the failed protest, the protest that doesn't take power, that persists and that continues on. The embers that glow the longest, that is the emancipated subject. It's not the subject who fights the tyrant and becomes the tyrant. It's the subject who realizes that there can be a world without tyrants. It's about saying that the ultimate illusion is precisely the illusion that you are on your way up. And that once you realize that as long as you think you're on your way up, everyone else can keep you down, that's when a much more structural, radical, in fact, symbolically violent upheaval takes place, in which up and down can become inverted, in which truth no longer just takes place up here, but truth manifests precisely in the lowest. And that's what we're going to explain next week when we do a final class on Žižek's Hegelianism and what that says about Marxism. Thank you so much. I hope I haven't been yelling too much, but it's for exciting stuff.
It is. Excellent.
I think we're going to do another bonus session.
Yeah. We're going to jump over to Discord. So if you are a patron, hopefully you'll have a link to our Discord where we can talk more about these things. Thank you very much for starting your week with us. Transcript will be forthcoming. Audio should be available soon. So thanks for joining us.
Big thank you to Jeneline,
Yeah,
who keeps the show on the road, who takes care of all the little things required for this to work. Thank you guys so much for creating this space,
Yes.
where we can be passionate and excited about ideas and philosophy in a way that's unapologetic. Because I love having this intense exchange with you guys, and hopefully it opens up doors in your thinking. I'm not trying to tell you what to think. I'm not trying to tell you how to think. I'm simply encouraging you to feel comfortable thinking, because I think it just takes a certain amount of support
And
to feel, and persistence to feel like you can think about these things, even when they don't seem to have direct, quote unquote, use value. So thank you guys so much. This is a true pleasure. I feel so humbled and grateful that I get to share this energy with you. And we're going to do another half-hour Q&A session in our podcast starting in 5 minutes. All right. Thanks, guys, and a big thank you to our patrons.
Yes.